social science, you are about to see a dramatization of an historic debate at the United States. Were still colonies, largely under the control of European powers. 1/3 of the population of the world lived in these areas. But since 1945, 20 nations have gained their independence. 650 million people in less than 15 years have risen up to win their freedom from colonial rule. This is a revolution of unprecedented size and scope. The story of these years has been the story of a colonial people rising up after centuries of foreign rule to demand freedom. And it is the story of a great debate about colonialism. On the one side, the newly independent nations of the Middle East and Asia, and on the other side, the colonial powers of the Western world. At the United Nations in September 1955, just such a debate took place. The subject, Algeria. Speaking for the anti-colonial bloc was Iraq.
The days of enslaving other peoples are gone. Humanity today must stand on the principles of justice, freedom, and equality.
And Saudi Arabia.
French policy had its origin in the colonial activities of the 18th century, with all of their crudities. And the Algerian people are within their rights when they demand independence from France.
On behalf of the colonial powers, Belgium.
I am ready to admit, indeed I do admit, that there are many things to be changed. But in saying that, may I not also ask you to recognize that we are already on the right road and that enormous progress has been made in freeing colonial people from what may be called the colonialism of the 19th century?
For the anti-colonial bloc, India.
The United Nations adopted the ideals of the French Constitution, the conception of human rights, which the French had accepted over 150 years ago. Therefore, to argue that we must not come here and talk about the human rights for Algeria is the wrong thing.
Finally, of course, France.
For over 100 years, Algeria has been united to France. Any Algerian, whether Muslim or Christian, is a French citizen. How and with what right can anyone come here today and question something that has been a fact of national and international life for more than a century?
The scene is the United Nations, September 1955. The occasion, an historic debate on Algeria. A debate which reflects profound conflict within the non-communist world, what to do about colonialism. Now, the debate between the colonial powers and the anti-colonial bloc usually turns on two basic questions. The first of these is human rights. Here is what the UN Charter has to say in part about human rights. We reaffirm our faith in fundamental human rights, in social progress and better standards of life, based on the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. Now, neither side in the dispute over colonialism disagrees with these principles, but how they are to be put into practice in specific cases, well, this is an entirely different matter. In our case study, the Algerian debate of 1955, a great deal of attention was paid to the question of human rights for the Algerian people.
What, in fact, is the ultimate objective of this debate? Is it freedom for the Muslim peoples of Algeria? In that case, I ask, are they not already free? Do they not already enjoy the universal right to vote? Are they not already represented in local assemblies, the Algerian Assembly, and all the national assemblies?
The French say, of course we believe in freedom, but the Algerians are already free.
Let us face facts. The French discriminate in Algeria against the non-European Muslim population by denying them equal opportunity for education and equal political rights. In the Algerian Assembly, 900,000 French Europeans have an equal number of seats with 9 million Muslims. Thus, 1 European equals 10 Muslims in Algeria.
From generalities to specifics, and a rather embarrassing subject for the French.
Of course, the identical thing holds true in the National Assembly in Paris. Algeria is allowed 30 deputies to the lower chamber of the French Parliament. 15 deputies represent some 900,000 French residents in Algeria. The other 15 deputies represent 9 million Algerian Muslims.
I have frequently in the past, as well as today, listened to delegates discussing the features of French electoral law and telling us that it ought to be overhauled. But they made the mistake of awakening my curiosity, and I went to the trouble of looking up electoral law in their own countries. I will not conceal from you my surprise at finding that in countries of many of the speakers that preceded me here, there was no electoral law at all.
The tables are turning. Good electoral laws, it seems, are everyone's business.
It is true that we don't have good electoral law. We recognize our backwardness. But the fact is that we are free to develop ourselves. And it is this blessing of freedom that is most fundamental and basic for all the people who wish to develop themselves as a human being worthy of that name.
The Belgian delegate has just described how certain states who ignored the very existence of the right to vote and the elementary rules of justice had the temerity to attack France. France will not tolerate insults or slanders against its civilizing work at a time when countries still exist in which minorities are subjected to cruelly discriminatory treatment, where abject poverty is fatalistically accepted, where the illiteracy rate is as high as 80%, and the infantile mortality rate, unfortunately, in the region of 800 per thousand. Let these countries appeal to the United Nations for guidance and assistance in the efforts which it is their duty to make at home. Therein lies the true mission of the United Nations. It is through constructive work that it should expand its activities.
Adroitly, the colonial powers have turned the discussion to an area where France's record is rather good.
One thing has astonished me in this debate. To listen to certain representatives, one would think that there's only one single human right, the right of a people to political independence. Now, far be it from me to deny for one moment the importance of that human right. But the right of a people to political independence is not the only right that must be guaranteed. Among those rights, we must include common justice and also, of course, social justice.
I hope the Belgian delegate will open the charter at chapter 11 and read along with me Article 73, which reads, to develop self-government, to take due account of the political aspirations of the people, and to assist them in the progressive development of their free political institutions according to the particular circumstances of each territory and its people and their varying stages of advancement. It is our obligation to see to it, whenever dependent people are mature and call for self-determination and freedom, these organizations must assist them.
We have returned to the question of political independence. Listen to the French delegate.
Much has been made of the fact that there are peoples in Algeria who differ in race, language, and religion from the population of continental France. And the conclusion has immediately been drawn that to be free, these people must be separate. This is a strange argument. Are we to understand that it is impossible for men of different races and religions to live together in peace as citizens of the same state? Could anyone in this forum wish to champion racial theories or provoke religious fanaticism?
Of course not.
We believe, and millions of people throughout the world share our belief, that it is possible for the Algerians and us to live side by side in peace, closely united in a single political organization.
But the real fact of the matter can be put quite simply. There are two people in Algeria, the French and the Algerian. And while the Algerian is fighting for liberation, France is using brutal repressive measures to quell this urge for freedom.
Everyone is in favor of freedom and justice. But how to achieve these rights is the first basic issue in the dispute over colonialism. The second issue is the question of jurisdiction. To whom does the colony rightfully belong? Now, this is very important. For one thing, if it can be shown that a colony rightfully belongs to the colonial power, in this case France, then the international community and the UN has no business discussing the question. The UN Charter puts it this way: the United Nations is not authorized to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state. Now, just as everyone believes in human rights, so everyone believes in the principle of domestic jurisdiction. The principle, that is, that each nation ought to run its own internal affairs. But the real question is, how do you decide whether or not a colonial power exercises legitimate jurisdiction in its colony? In the Algerian debate of 1955, colonial and anti-colonial powers struggled with the question of jurisdiction, and once again were sharply divided.
My statement will be brief, but very direct. Since 1830, that's for more than 120 years, Algeria has been an integral part of French territory. Every international treaty that we have passed, including the United Nations Charter, applies to Algeria as French territory, and no one has ever thought of disputing that fact.
In Algeria, I remind you, live 1 million European and 9 million Muslims. It is strange in the age of freedom and equality, we are told that Algeria belongs to France. Algeria, where 9/10 of the population are not French at all.
I do not say that Algeria belongs to France. I say that Algeria is France. For over 100 years, Algeria has been united to France on an equal footing with the Ile-de-France, Brittany or Auvergne, such that any Algerian, whether Muslim or Christian, is a French citizen.
The French appeal to history and French law, but these are not the only criteria.
The attitude which the French appear to take is that since Algeria is a part of France, an Algerian is a Frenchman. We lived in India for many centuries as a dependency. We were called at one time British subjects. That was bad enough. But nobody dared to call us Englishmen or told us that we should call ourselves Englishmen. So to an Algerian, or to anybody who is not French, to be called a Frenchman is not a great honor, in our humble opinion.
What are the opponents of France doing? They are discussing the scope, validity, the wisdom of a number of French laws. And what laws are these? Some of the laws in question are over a century old. What you are actually doing is discussing a whole group of French constitutional laws. The French Constitution of 1875 and that of 1948 govern the relations between France and Algeria.
But there is something new. There are no Muslim peoples in Algeria. There is no Algerian nation in that part of the world. The inhabitants of Algeria are French. They are not Algeria. And with this simple affirmation, an attempt is made to erase a whole chapter in the history of the brilliant Muslim civilization. And we in the United Nations must accept with blind religious faith what the Constitution of the French Republic says. An attempt is being made to hoodwink this assembly. Over a century of military and political occupation of Algerian territory and the subjection of a whole people to a foreign yoke do not, in our opinion, constitute an irrevocable title of ownership and dominion.
The Saudi Arabian delegate argues that Algeria was conquered and therefore the United Nations has the right to intervene in Algerian affairs.
Yes.
But Flanders, Burgundy, Aquitania and Roussillon, French provinces whose French character no one dreams of disputing, were also conquered. If we were to assume a right to question all frontiers resulting from wars, there would no longer be any security for any state possessing such frontiers.
Suppose the United States of America had adopted a law in its Congress claiming that the Philippines were part of the United States. And later, the noble people of the Philippines rose and asked for their independence and freedom. Could anyone say that the Philippines was part of the United States? And therefore, one was not entitled to deal with the issues because it involved the internal jurisdiction of the United States, but this is an exact simile.
If the Assembly decides to discuss the French problem of Algeria, there would be nothing in the future to stop each of us from exercising the right to intervene in the domestic affairs of any of us. That would be the end of security for many and independence for the weakest. In my country's opinion, the decision that will be taken by the Assembly will be far more serious for the United Nations than for France. The future of this organization will be at stake.
So everyone agrees there must be no interference in the domestic affairs of any state. But how do you decide what are domestic affairs? France attempts to prove that the Algerian question is her own business. A century of history and 100 years of French law prove that Algeria is French. The anti-colonial bloc, on the other hand, insists that this is not just a squabble within the French household. History and law, they argue, do not make an Algerian Muslim a Frenchman if he doesn't choose to be one. So how do you decide whether or not a colonial problem is a domestic dispute or one which it is legitimate for the international community to discuss and to act upon? Human rights and domestic jurisdiction, everyone agrees with these ideas in principle. However, in their practical application, there is profound disagreement. Inevitably and ominously, the debate now moved toward a complete impasse.
We come now to the next aspect. Even if we were entitled to discuss this, and if we're not committing a breach of the rules in discussing it, should we discuss it? That is a very legitimate question to ask. Is it politically wise? What are the gains and the losses? Let me say, we of India would be belying our own liberation if we leave behind too often still await liberation. In the United Nations, there are at least 20 or 22 states who would not be here if the argument raised by France prevailed. The whole basis of their existence stands challenged. That is to say, if an empire cannot be overthrown, if a conqueror cannot be displaced, if lost liberty cannot be rewon, then very few of us will have a place here. I think the discussion of the Algerian question will assist in allowing some of the pent-up steam to be released without explosions. It will give the Algerian people some confidence in that the other people are thinking of them.
After 3 or 4 weeks of discussions, what could we say? We could say that the Algerian problem has disturbed us. We could ask the French government to take urgent steps to deal with it. We could ask it to seek a peaceful solution acceptable to the majority of the Algerians. That is the most we could do. What then is the object of all this debate? Why must all this political wisdom, all this human sagacity be mixed with so much emotion, so many insults, so many wounding remarks?
When my people read daily in the press that their brethren in Algeria who are both Arab and Muslims are being dealt with by helicopters, by airplane, by French armed forces, that so many Algerians have been shot and that so many villages have been destroyed, what would one expect the repercussions to be concerning the relations of my people with the people of France?
I know that as a speaker I am given to polemics, and I must sometimes make a great effort to restrain myself. But I must admit that what I have witnessed here today, I am saying it as kindly as possible without raising my voice, has struck me as bizarre. Some representatives and delegates are really, I'm looking for the most parliamentary and least offensive term, very imprudent. To my opinion, international life can only be based on 2 great virtues. The spirit of moderation and the spirit of understanding. There's no international question in which one country is entirely right and the other entirely wrong. The truth is quite otherwise. The first virtue of a politician who aspires to international politics is to try to understand. The second is moderation. There is nothing gained in international affairs by rushing headlong into extreme and exaggerated solutions. A true international policy is, I'm not ashamed to proclaim it, an international policy based on compromise. What then is to be done? The answer is simple. We must trust France. Now, does France deserve our trust? I was shocked indeed to hear it implied here that France is imperialistic, colonist, bloodthirsty, and cruel. I do not say that all the pages of French history are equally fine, but where is the country that has bestowed on mankind so many and such diverse benefits, intellectual, scientific, and political? And before condemning such a people outright in thoughtless terms, the critics should pause and reflect upon the long tradition of a glorious past.
My delegation regrets to say that we have had no evidence that France deserves our trust. We have little confidence in any act of France with regard to Algeria, and it would do the United Nations no honor to ignore the appeal for justice by the Algerian people. It would be perilous to place their fate at the mercy of France's ruthless forces.
Very well. Let us suppose that the argument opposed to mine prevails. What is the very least that France could do? It is what all of us would do if we were in France's position. It would be not to submit to the strange verdict of this assembly, but rather to say, continue the procedures you have started, but without me. I contest your jurisdiction, and I am leaving. And whatever you decide then without France would be nothing more than beating the air.
This was the debate on Algeria in the United Nations in September 1955. Both sides were now embittered. France accused the UN of unjustified interference in her internal affairs. The anti-colonial bloc accused France of unjustified colonialism, of using methods of force and repression, and insisted that it was the duty of the UN to call attention to these injustices. In the United Nations General Assembly, tensions mounted rapidly. The issue was finally put to a vote. The exact question was, should the Algerian dispute be placed on the agenda of the General Assembly? 28 nations voted to include the Algerian item. 27 voted against placing Algeria on the agenda. The anti-colonial bloc had won its fight for the moment. Then Monsieur Pinet, the head of the entire French delegation, mounted the rostrum. He stunned the assembly. He said,
I must state that in a matter which is essentially within its domestic jurisdiction, my government refuses to accept any intervention of the United Nations which would be in defiance of the provisions of the Charter. It will consider as null and void any recommendation which the General Assembly might make on the matter. My government is going to consider the question, and I say this in all seriousness and with deep regret. I do not know what consequences the vote which has just been taken will have on the relations between France and the United Nations.
A shocked assembly watched the startling climax to a bitter debate. This historic debate on Algeria took place in September 1955 and continued with increasing bitterness in the years which followed. It illustrates one of the most important results of the revolution in the colonial world, the depth and the intensity of the conflict between the colonial powers of the West and the newly independent nations of Asia and Africa. This conflict divides the non-communist world, weakens the Western community, and threatens peace. Well, what can be done about it? First, most reasonable men will agree that in this debate neither side is fully right nor completely wrong. Subject people are demanding the right to run their own affairs, and this is natural and inevitable. Most people who believe in democracy will agree that this demand is just. However, it must also be pointed out that it is no small matter to disrupt the institutions of government and society which have been developed over centuries. Second, most students of the colonial problem feel that a colonial power must realistically and responsibly prepare its colonies for self-rule. They must train leadership. They must develop a stable economy. And third, many feel that the colonial powers in general will not put forth energetic efforts to develop responsible self-rule unless they are forced to do so by the fear of violence. The anti-colonial bloc, on the other hand, must recognize that preparation for self-rule requires time, and that no one will gain if through the use of force a colonial people achieves self-rule before it is prepared for it. One conclusion certainly seems certain. There will remain serious differences between the colonial and anti-colonial worlds for a long time to come. That is why, in the words of the Belgian delegate, restraint and moderation are so necessary. For without restraint and without moderation, the colonial revolution will tear the free world apart, and all of us will be the loser. The debate you have just seen was a condensed reenactment of the actual debates in the United Nations on the Algerian question. Statements of the delegates portrayed here were excerpted in every case from the records of United Nations proceedings without change except for purposes of compression and continuity.
This is National Educational Television.